The Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola. Sometimes a wild god comes to the table. He is awkward and does not know the ways of porcelain, of fork and mustard and silver. His voice makes vinegar from wine.
Those were the opening words to Sometimes a Wild God, read by the author and my guest today on the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This season of the podcast is brought to you by the Threshold Community, a new collaboration between me and my dear friend Holly Trular. We're gathering online with like-minded, collapse-aware people to tend the threshold of the twilight times of the world as we've known it. Read all about it at thethresholdcommunity.com and find us on Instagram at Tending the Threshold. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, and today on the show, I'm absolutely delighted to share with you a conversation with the poet and author, Tom Hirons. Now, this is the time when I'm supposed to read you his bio and tell you all about his works, but to be frank, there is no introduction that can really explain what happens when a poet seizes your life. And unless it's happened to you, you might not believe that the reading of a poem could change the trajectory of your life or the way you live. But what I am telling you is true. And if you've never heard the poem, Sometimes a Wild God, then this conversation is good prologue. And if you're not familiar with some of Tom's other works, such as Nettle Eater or Falconer's Joy, which we go into in some detail, then this will help you arrive to the works with heart and mind prepared. And if you are arriving to this conversation already, like me, an ardent fan of Tom's works, then you're welcome. Here's my conversation with Tom Hirons. So, Tom, what identities do you lead with?
What identities do I lead with? I've heard you ask this question a couple of times, and I think for me, for a number of reasons, it's not a question that I'm used to really working with, and I suspect that a lot of that is because I'm a 47-year-old white hetero male, and I don't have to work with it. But also thinking about it, I was thinking, you ask a poet and a storyteller about identity, and you're really asking for the longest I am poem in the history of podcasts. So, how long have we got? About an hour, 2 hours. I can keep it going probably for about a week. I'm feeling on form. But I was thinking, okay, I'm less interested in that kind of identity that you might be able to put down in a kind of straight line kind of way than thinking about it in a poetic sense. You know, what is it that I'm trying to do? And obviously there's a clue I've given already. I'm a writer, I'm a storyteller. On a good day, I might claim to be a poet. And what I think I'm really identifying as, when I'm thinking in those terms, is some kind of tracker, some kind of listener, someone who's interested in the kind of truth that if you approach it head on through straight line kind of language, it gets hidden or it gets scared and runs away. So I'm one of those slant-wise truth tellers, and hopefully a listener as well. And sometimes I track well, there's a good day, and sometimes I don't track so well either with my speech or my listening. So I think I would identify as an apprentice to that kind of craft or art, whichever or both it might be. And that's primarily who I am in context of our conversation here today. But as I say, I'm also 47-year-old white hetero male, father of 2 young boys. One's 5.5, and one will be 2 in December. I was brought up in East Anglia, rural East Anglia in the UK, a nice, pretty gentle part of the world. And then lived for about 20 years in Scotland. Lived on the road in a travelling storytelling theatre, an old truck with my partner Rima, and now we've settled in South Devon, not far from Dartmoor, which is where I've just got back from a few days ago 7 days of wild camping by myself. And if you ask me who my identity is when I'm out there, it would be a very different kind of thing. But you've got me in my more or less civilized state today. So
Civilized.
that's me.
I will say, rather humble, I think, to call yourself an apprentice, because there are plenty of, folks that we could maybe describe as storytellers who approach, kind of sidling up sideways and that sort of thing. But what's really exceptional about your work for me is that even though you're tracking and not going directly at a thing, I never feel disoriented or discombobulated. Whereas there are plenty of folks
I
where
should try harder. I must try harder. Just for you, I'm going to write you a poem just to discombobulate you, Pam.
Okay. Well, I'll be very excited then by it, because there are plenty of people who discombobulate then, I guess, with far less charm and wisdom than
you're
you
very
do.
kind. You're too kind. I know some and know of more really good poets and great storytellers, and so my standards are very, very high. And it's good for me to kind of know my place. That it keeps me at least with a semblance of humility.
So I was first introduced to your work, probably like many people, with your seminal poem, Sometimes a Wild God. And I would love to know how that poem came to you.
Okay, how did that poem come to me? Well, when we start talking about where poems come from, or how that came about, or what that means, or what all of that kind of thing, we're kind of using quite invasive language about something which is quite subtle. But there are things that I can say about it that don't do it harm in any way. The poem, I had been carrying around this line, however it begins, sometimes a wild God comes to the table, because I thought I'd read this line somewhere, and I thought, this is a fantastic line. I have to, I thought maybe I'd read it in Iron John, or some some rag and bone shop of the heart, or something like that, because it sounded like that kind of territory. And I couldn't find it. I kept looking for it over a period of 2, maybe 3 years, and I couldn't find it. And eventually I was like, shit, maybe it doesn't actually exist yet, and in which case I'm going to have to write this thing. I'm going to have to pull on that thread, or follow that thread down into the cave and see what happens. And so I did, and it was actually part of a series of poems, which some of which saw the light of day in a thing called the Journal of Mythic Arts. I don't know if you ever came across that. Terry Windling and Midori Snyder, who I could tell a very long story about how that publication was how Rima and I got together in the first place, and how I ended up on Dartmoor, but I'm not going to tell you that. So this series of poems was about different deities arriving in the home, or in your life, or all of this thing. And so I'd written one about Apollo. It was an awful poem. It was really, really very bad, and I wasn't that into it. I wasn't really into Apollo at the time. I was much more into the kind of tangled roots of things. And then I wrote one about Hermes. A very shady, angry poem. And then I thought I better write about the wild, because I've got this line here that I need to tug on. And so I sat down one evening and drank some Guinness and wrote the poem, and pretty much in a wanna.
Wow.
I did an edit a few days later, put it up on the blog that I had, and kind of that was it, really. Kind of a few people. I had a wide audience of about 12 or 15 people at that stage, and I put the poem up, and that was that for months and months.
Wow.
And
And
then
then did it go on the Dark Mountain Project? Is that,
that
did
was
it have an association there?
that happened a little bit later. Yeah, I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was their third book, I think. Yeah, their third book. I put that and Metal Eater, an early version of Metal Eater into that, because Rima had done the cover for their second book, and we'd ended up going to the strange little festival that they held called Uncivilization. And because I didn't want to pay to get in. I said I'd do some storytelling, and that was kind of the start of a whole relationship with Dark Mountain, and a kind of a different kind of mood change for my storytelling as well.
Yeah, I bet they strike a certain mood, right? And I really resonate with it. So I think it was sort of through that association that I first became aware of the poem, or it came through, the ether through there. So I'm sure that you have had many people say, how wrecked they've been by this poem in a great way. But honestly, the first time we read it, my husband and I can't remember if he found it and read it out loud to me, or I found it and read it out loud to him. I think he might have read it out loud to me. He has a very deep, mellifluous voice. And we were both just bawling. Like, we couldn't, get through it. And it really, and it came to me in my 39th year at my 40th birthday party. The theme was wild gods and goddesses, because based on this poem. And so everybody showed up. I had these massive deer antlers and kind of, this wild
It's a
goddess.
wonderfully dangerous theme for a party.
Yeah, exactly. And for a woman turning 40. So it was very
fantastic.
apt. And Ruben read that poem aloud to me, for me, and for everyone. And it just, and it wrecks the crowd. You go from 80s music to Sometimes a Wild God, but it was so fantastic. People, couldn't get enough. And so now when I buy it in stacks of 10 to give it away. I'm curious though, what's the most common response that you see from people who first hear that poem?
People cry.
Mm-hmm.
I don't often get to see people's response. I don't often read it out. But people write to me a lot with how it's affected them, and it makes people cry, either for what they've lost, usually for what they've lost. So there's a grief that comes in at a particular point in the poem for a lot of people, or there's the joy of recognition of someone writing about something that they have not found articulated somewhere else, and it's a great delight and a great honor to hear those things being said about something which I've been involved in, and very moving. People have this strong relationship with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can't pretend to be normal anymore. It's one of these poems, you read it, and if it's calling you out, it's calling you out. And if it's naming your deepest sorrow, you're a little embarrassed because everybody knows now, and you can't try to go back to any other way of being anymore. It kind of undoes you in the way that's like, well, I guess I have to start living now.
I thought we were done. I thought we were done with hiding, though. So to be honest about that particular kind of ancient, that kind of wound which touches a place that feels so ancient. I thought that was common knowledge. So so for me, it was a lot of the poem is kind of stating the obvious, but some kind of accidental things have happened along the way in the way the poem has come together that gives it kind of uncanny power. And I really don't feel that an awful lot of that has to do with my skill as a poet. I was very good at listening on the day that that poem was about and needed someone to write it down. And that is skill of ear and heart, being able to put myself in a position where the words can come in kind of down my fingers or through my ears and head and all of that. Yeah.
So that was one of those good days when you might call yourself a poet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
But I mean, the funny thing is, and I wrote that in 2012, I think it was, and I've learned a lot more about how to be a good poet since then, but I don't think I've necessarily written any good poems in the last 8 years. There have been a couple that have been all right, and a couple that I think are better than Sometimes a Wild God. But I'm very much still learning. I'm lucky. I've got a silver tongue, and I'm a good listener, and that takes me a long way. But when I read about how other poets work, it's like, wow, you're engaged in some amazing, amazing craft while you're doing this. And a lot of that's still a total mystery to me. I'm reading a beautiful book by Glenn Maxwell at the moment called On Poetry. By far the best book about writing poetry that I've come across. And it's just heartbreakingly honest in points and very, very beautiful and very skillful. And there's a lot in there where I think, oh my God, you've really thought about this shit. And here I am just kind of going, oh, I'll listen. I'll put my kind of ear to the universe and see what comes in, and then kind of try and make it look like a poem. So as you can see, there's a little imposter syndrome, but
a little bit.
that's okay, because the field of poetry is so wide and varied and fertile that you can get away with pretty much anything.
As a listener, then, at the moment, what's your favorite line or section of that poem?
It's pretty much always the same one, actually. So I've got the book here. I was just saying to you before we started recording that we've just had a delivery of the new print run, and it's beautiful. So I'm just, here we go. It's this one. So the stanza is, the wild god points to your side. You are bleeding heavily. You have been bleeding for a long time, possibly since you were born. There is a bear in the wound. And this is the one which isn't necessarily the most relevant to my life, but it's the one that has kick to it, or talk, in the sense of that twisting thing. That's how I think of kind of the force of poetry is talk.
It's torque.
And that is the one where you, when I do read it and I can see people, that's the one where you can just see something happen inside. And that's the one which I'm starting to understand the poem as a kind of spell, the way it does this kind of corkscrew thing going deeper down. And there's a big twist there.
Absolutely. That for sure. For sure. And then right
cry.
after that, I know, I
do
can
feel
cry. The torque in my
go
guts right now. I can feel it just twisting, and it's true. That's the one where you get pretty wrecked pretty instantly. And if you get it, there's no going back after that. That's the stating of the obvious, the thing that you were talking about. It's like, I thought everybody knew. I thought everybody, but you, kind of point to this beautiful physiological experience. It's interesting because that section does have a biological rightness to it. Even if a person doesn't understand what else is happening in the poem, there's a biological rightness to it that you feel in your body. Yeah.
Well, there's just a a little background there, because what I didn't say in who I am and my identity, because it's not part of who I am right now, I'm an acupuncturist as well. So my training is in Chinese medicine. So there's a stanza just after that or just before that where we're talking about the unnameable beasts in your kidneys and your heart and your liver. And in Chinese medicine, they're not unnameable beasts. They have names. The hun, the zhe, they're the spirits of these particular organs. And so when I'm talking about that, I'm not just using fancy metaphorical language. As far as I'm concerned, I'm just again talking about something that is. And so I think that kind of sense of there being a reality there and not just a metaphor comes from that.
That's so beautiful. Right. So you are naming something that people have actually known for a long time and given these names with these animal figures. And yeah, that's amazing. That's beautiful.
And
So
sneaky.
it's so sneaky. Thank you for
Yeah.
revealing at least one of your magician's tricks here.
I'm
You're
only
working on
revealing
us.
that one so that I can obscure others.
And you, sitting there, do you know these things? Look at that world beyond your door. Your life is on fire. Run! Dive in, though it surely means death. Taste the streams, the heather and the gorse and the broom. Hold the river stones. Sleep with the waterfall as your pillow. Braid yourself to the horse's mane. Sing the great lament of your own lost life. In time, scar yourself with fire and stone. Immerse yourself in such immovable darkness that the lightning cracks you in two. You were never more lost than you are now. If you cannot reach out, touch the wild earth and weep.
I'd love to switch to Nettle Eater. I did not know that you had lived in Scotland, land of my way back ones. And so my question for you was, what sort of tradition does Nettle Eater come from? Because it does have kind of this Scottish folkloric tone and feel to it. And on the one hand, you could say on the face of it, it's because of how it relates to the Fae, or I suppose, but also because it does kind of have this ominous breeze through it that seems very Scottish to me.
Well, I think that what you're identifying as that Scottish unease, I would say, is a more all-pervading thing in British kind of myth and folklore. Certainly in Welsh myth or kind of Brythonic myth, there's that same just kind of the unease of the land. It's not a tranquil, constantly abiding sense of beauty and wonder. There are things of complexity and danger and varying shades of light and dark out there. And so I was just thinking, okay, is there anything Scottish in there as such? Not consciously, not consciously. There's a lot in there which is more West Country and more Welsh in a way. And there's a lot that's Anglo-Saxon. So and there's a lot that's Tibetan. because the whole story of Nettle Eater is based on the story of Milarepa. Do you know the story of Milarepa, the great
I
Tibetan
know the
saint?
name, but please
Yeah.
say more.
Okay. Well, he is Tibet's favorite bad boy turned good, because he learned, this was a long time ago. Well, I don't know, 1,000 years ago, maybe even longer, or maybe not so long at all. But he was very bad and learned how to use magic to kill his enemies. And he killed some of his enemies, and then he thought, this is a terrible thing I've done. I need to change my ways. So he took some instruction from his guru. He found a guru. I think it was Marpa the translator, or Naropa, I can't remember. I used to be a Tibetan Buddhist, but I fell very badly, and now I just mine it for good stories. And he lived in a cave and ate nothing but nettles for 7 years. And he turned green and learned to fly, and became Tibet's best loved saint. And when he's depicted, he's holding a shell to his ear like this to hear the sound of the universe. And he's quite a character.
Wow. So did you immerse yourself in imagination to do this, or did you go and, spend a season in Nettle Eater? It's a year, but did you do some of this?
You're asking literal truths now about territory which is rapidly becoming far more interesting and halfway between metaphorical and real. We're moving into myth and faction and things in between. So I'm not going to answer that.
Okay, yeah, I know it's very unfair to ask a poet to explain their poems. I am going to keep asking, and you can just keep answering poetically. Yeah,
sure.
Right.
Let's do that. That's a good deal.
Okay, okay. Well, but on this theme, Nettle Eater, certainly, and then even in Falconer's Joy, your small book of 5 poems, there are at least, I would describe at least 3 of the poems, probably 4, in Falconer's Joy, pretty much like Merivale, Worship of Place, Dead Fathers, and Lapwing Stars. Everything except Falconer's Joy sounds like either you are on a wilderness quest or fast, you've just returned
I thought you were
from
going
a
to say on
wilderness
drugs.
quest.
You
No,
sound like you're on drugs, Tom.
Though, questing is an altered state of consciousness. It's for sure, there's definitely there is a non-ordinary reality to them, for sure. But also, as a person who leads wilderness quests and has done many wilderness quests and fasting quests of, like doing the, exhaustion and sleeping exposed in nature, not eating or, for 100 hours, I'm like, this sounds like somebody who goes out and fasts on the moor. so
Sure.
is that
I do that.
part of what you do?
Yeah, I'm a wilderness vigil guide,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly I can remember way back in 2000, 2005, maybe something like that, when I did my first wilderness fast up in Snowdonia in Wales, one of the most beautiful places in the British Isles. By chance, I was in a group that was being run by a guy called David Wendelbury, and one of his students was a guy called Martin Shaw, who was also running a course there, and they double booked the little cottage they were using as base camp. So we ended up having this huge group with David and Martin running the thing, and that's the first time I met Martin, way back then. But that's an aside. But that first wilderness fast took place in Snowdonia, which is steeped in myth. This mountain Cadair Idris, which we fasted on, has all sorts of potent myths about spend the night on the top of it, then you'll come back down either a poet or a madman or dead, and all this kind of stuff. And so that point when I did that fast 15 years ago, that's when actually my poetry started to get any any kind of talk in it at all,
Mm.
because I had found a place that was interesting and deep and true enough to be able to write about it in a language which wasn't straightforward, telling the truth in this straight line way. I could use mythological language. I could use the imagery of kind of timeless experience to speak absolutely truly about this kind of stuff. So definitely that infused my writing from there on, very much. Yeah, I mean, all of Sometimes a Wild God, Nettle Eater, and yeah, like you say, most of the poems in Falconer's Joy, and a lot of the things I've written are informed by that, and I'm trying to tell the truth of that kind of experience, because I believe passionately that the personal and cultural need for that kind of either breakthrough or restoration in the wild is fundamentally important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. I feel such validation, but also kinship, because it's true when you've done. First of all, I also want to say I love the term wilderness vigil. I've never actually heard those two. I've used the term vigil around this, but I'm like, oh, I'm going to maybe take out quest out of everything that I do and put vigil, because that's so much more what it is. The quest has such a kind of like hero's journey, patriarchal, we're going to overcome nature. It's like, oh, good luck.
Yeah,
So
I
I love
think
that.
I think that's one of Martin's terms, actually. I think
Thank you.
I've picked that up from him.
Mm.
And for me, it's been a really important kind of drift down the years, from using the notion of vision quest to
Mm-hmm.
wilderness rites of passage to
Passage.
wilderness fast, and and realizing that a lot of what I'm involved in isn't actually rites of passage. That's a total misnomer. It's about people just going and getting the fundamental goodness of putting their bones down on the hill and doing the
Mm-hmm.
dreaming, getting dreamed, however it works. And so the wilderness vigil, even wilderness is a misnomer in the
Mm-hmm.
UK. Dartmoor is
Wow.
a place
Yeah.
I love wonderfully and deeply, and in ways that I don't even comprehend. But it's not a wilderness. I've just spent 7 days tucked up in the kind of folds of the moor. And I came out of my tent one morning, and there's a photographer standing across the stream from where I'm camped. Good morning, 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 lovely morning. Yes, cup of tea. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, this is not the wilderness.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
even where we are, though, same thing. I mean, when I'm leading, we drove thousands of kilometers all throughout British Columbia, supposedly one of the quote unquote wildest places in Canada. Really, if you want to get to true backcountry, you need a helicopter. And so it's the realm of the elite. And so
yeah,
this was the big thing.
completely.
We need a place with no grizzly bears, no black flies, and no lights. For fuck's sakes, no lights
Yeah,
from,
yeah.
and that, so we did find a place, but even then, we know that there is no such thing as wilderness
Mm-hmm.
in what we think that it is, even manifest destiny. We know that Indigenous folks had actually been stewarding, whether it
Yeah,
was through fire stewardship or what we would call now, forest permaculture. I mean, all of it was stewarded for thousands of
totally,
years,
totally.
even though, a lot of the Gaels who came over, their word for Canada essentially was like the big deep wood, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Like, so, but
and fair enough.
yeah.
But we've foolishly, I think, conflated our grief about the urbanization of most of the land that we know, or certainly I know, and our longing for wilder places, with this work that we're involved with, which doesn't actually require wilderness. And like you
Mm-hmm.
say, it's got some really important things. Yeah, no lights, no people, no midges is nice here.
Right.
I've put someone out on a hill that was midge infested, and
Mm.
yeah, that,
It's a whole
they're
different experience.
they're doing fine now. A lot of therapy. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, so yeah,
Yeah.
it's a kind of a misnomer.
But when you've done that vigil work out on the land, then you know it when you hear it. Even a person who didn't know that you were out, if you've gone out and done it, you read these poems and you're like, this person has, I've done this thing that they're describing in words that I would never use for it. It's describing scenes I've never seen, but I know this state that this person is describing. So that's really lovely to discover that about you.
Well, in the old Anglo-Saxon magic, or the old Anglo-Saxon conception of the world, we tend to be quite rude about Anglo-Saxon stuff, but they had some interesting notions, and one of them was this idea of the wyrd, or the word, wyrd, and that there was this kind of the nature of the wyrd, was that there were fibers kind of coming down and through everything, and that if you knew how to essentially kind of pluck or twang or manipulate those fibers, you could effect change at a distance to other things. And my belief is that when true words are spoken in a skillful and magical way, or if a story is told in a way which has that same kind of magic about it, what you're doing is playing those chords of the wyrd in a way which can be felt, and people who are receptive to that, or who have experienced states where the chords of the wyrd are humming all around them, they've been struck in the same way as those chords during those experiences. So there's a kind of harmonic memory or something like that. That's the image that comes to me today. And so my aim with the writing and with the storytelling mostly these days is to pluck those chords of the wyrd in a way which sings, because that will then sing in someone else. And if they, yeah, like you say, if they've had an experience, then it will harmonize, and there'll be this feeling of recognition, that kind of
I really got that in the lapwing stars. I had to actually look up what a lapwing is. We don't have a bird called the lapwing, as far as I know, in my region. But once I looked it up, but the whole poem is about this unnameable thing, but you just described it. And as I read it, I was like, oh, I get what he's pointing to in here. And yeah, the more literal aspect, of course, is like, describe it, but you describe in every possible way this thing, this unnameable thing that you're describing now, as a chord gets struck, and it's the wyrd. Am I sort of getting what you're getting at here?
I believe so.
Okay.
Very, very much so. I really like that poem. The Lapwing Stars. It's one of the ones that I'm really pleased with. That was a good one, and it works. Lapwings also have a particular place in Welsh and kind of general Celtic mythology when speaking about the mystery of things. So I'll leave that as homework for listeners to go and find out about the Lapwing. And if they were to go and listen to some Robin Williams recordings of old myths and stories, they might find some interesting stuff in there. So the lapwing is an important bird, and where I was brought up, I used to see hundreds and hundreds of lapwings in the fields, and now you don't see them hardly anymore.
Really? Wow! In one lifetime, in your lifetime. Oh, I can't. You need to write a poem about the grief of that, because you can't name that either.
I'm still trying to write that poem.
I actually also had to look up Kader Idris and
Yeah.
and realize, and then okay, just being totally honest, that put me on this whole thing about Idris Alba. That basically means like Welsh Scotland or something. Like
Totally.
what's up
That
with his
that
name? That's
never occurred to
amazing.
me.
But me
Yeah.
neither until I had to look that up, and I was like, oh my gosh, he's like this mythic figure. What
Yeah.
is going on there? Who named him with such powerful, you
You
know? Yeah.
need to get him on the show.
Yes,
Come on,
yes,
ask him
yes.
straight out.
We're
We need
just
to know.
we're
Are you a
planting that.
mythological being? Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, aside from the obvious. Okay, so then this leaves this one poem in Falconer's Joy, the namesake, Falconer's Joy.
Mhm.
I know I'm not supposed to ask poets what is that about, but
No,
it's
you
like,
can
is
do it
that
just to
about your
make them.
dad? What is that about? What is
What the fuck is that about?
daddy issues one?
Uh,
What's happening here? Is this you? Who are we talking about? And what is Falconer's Joy about? It stands out
what
to
is?
me as uniquely personal.
Yeah, and yet it's not.
Hmm.
So, as you've pointed out, to ask a poet what's this poem about is just a way of making them uncomfortable and kind of grumpy, usually. But as we're having a nice time, I'll be polite, and it's it's about what it says it's about. Is the kind of dull clodhopper way of saying it. It's about a man in a difficult quarter of his life trying to negotiate um, the complex and uncomfortable relationship between gravity and flight, between commitment and freedom, between the substantial and the insubstantial. It's kind of about those things, but really, I have to take a step back, and several steps back, because with poetry and writing prose for me and storytelling, it's an act of faith often, and I don't know why I'm writing what I'm writing or telling what I'm telling. It's a story. Sometimes a story I'll come across one and it'll just say, right, you're going to tell me, and I'll go, I don't want to. I don't like you. You're not a nice story or a good story. You're a boring story, which is the worst thing that you can say to a story. They don't like that at all, and they'll carry on saying, no, no, no. This is your job. You listen, and when one of us tells you, you tell us. And it's the same with poetry sometimes. I don't know if there is someone out there who needs to read the words as they are in the order that they are in. Falconer's Joy. I'll never know. Maybe I will know one day. But it said, write me this way. And so I did. Um, and I can say that about absolutely anything, but it is a faith and trust, and it's part of my deal, my apprenticeship with this kind of this thing, with language, with truth telling, with listening. That every so often you have to just go, okay, yeah, I don't know, I'm not in charge here, so I'll put, like, it's easy to say that. It's less easy to put your name on a poem and put it in a book saying, yeah, this is going to be printed and everyone's going to read this and they're going to go, what the fuck does this mean, Tom? Did your dad throw himself off a hillside? What? Um,
Right.
and no, not at all. But I can give you a little background to that place because it's all about place there. So where that poem is set is a mountain in mid Wales called Mount Epint, Epint, and it is a place that my grandparents lived close to, um, and so I know it quite well. It's a sorrowful place. It's got a sorrowful story because up until 1940 there was kind of a community of about 200, 300 people living there, farmers. And in 1940, they were all cleared from the land to make way for the army, who still use the land as training ground and fire their guns and rockets and what have you. So it's a desolate place, scarred by by munitions, and the ghostly weeping of those people who were cleared out without any compensation in the 1940s. But there's a little village just off the Epint where my grandparents are buried and my father is buried, who died quite young of cancer. I'm older than he was when he died now, which is a very strange place to be. And when I had finished editing all the poems in that book, I went and visited the grave, and I read all those poems to him to see what he would think of them, which is a thing that evidently I value, and that's the way I roll. And it is not totally true to say it's not about him, but it's definitely not a literal truth. So that one is there as some kind of unknown key that unlocks a door that I don't even know what house or castle or ship it's in.
Yeah. That it does, though, hearing you speak about it does affirm the theme that seems so personal to me, which it seems there's this thread around kind of like the exile of masculinity, the loneliness of men. There's sort of this like distant figure of the wife at the other end of the line, but also distracted there, and it just, there's so much inner world that seems locked in this man. And it's like, wow.
It's painful. He's in a really painful state, and I suppose, in all honesty, that dislocation and aloneness and inner anguish of men in this time is something very close to my heart. The more I touch in on the worlds of men's work currently and compare it to all the incredible women's work going on about me, I see that we have so much to do, and we're grappling with so much brokenness that we're still really just screaming angrily in yurts, and we haven't got very far. So the brokenness of the modern man is definitely something that I am sitting with a lot, more so than ever at the moment. Actually, I've kind of just got a bit involved in Mackenzie's Mythic Masculine podcast and group, and got some interesting things coming up around that kind of work. But yeah.
Well, thank God. Thank God, thank goodness. So when you have, since you've been grappling, you've been out on the land, you've been grappling for a long time, you're involved with Dark Mountain many years now, and in a certain kind of way, obviously you're a person aware of collapse, the converging emergencies of large scale cooperation dilemmas and, the dominoes falling. So was there a certain moment where you just kind of looked around and was like, fuck it, I guess I should just be a poet? This is all going to shit anyway. Like, who needs to make a living? Like, what did you?
That's an interesting framing, Carmen. If things are so bad, I may as well be a poet. That's not quite how I came to it, fundamentally.
Right. But I mean, given how we treat poets, it's not
sure.
like the bardic past in Scotland, or, where you would have been the right hand of the king,
No, I mean, we are kind of scum, but also that
or treated that way, not as you aren't.
we really are. there is still that um, that value that our society here does put on poets. It holds them in this weird regard of kind of utter contempt, fascination, distaste. Poets are weird. They have weird powers to make you feel stuff, and so it's there's the whole notion of the poet laureate and all this kind of thing. It's a very strange position that we have for poets. But yeah, mostly it is that the images of the poet starving to death in their garret, and basically unless you do that, you're not a proper poet. And I tried that for quite a long time, and it was very, very poor. But basically, what happened was I didn't decide to be a poet. I wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to be known for beautiful language and telling sophisticated truths in eloquent ways in books. But I started off studying theoretical physics and logic, philosophy of science at university, and very quickly dropped out. And then tried again and dropped out again. But the second time I dropped out, I was living in Edinburgh then, and there was one May morning, and I've been reading some really good books. I've been reading Michael Ondaatje, In the Skin of a Lion, and I've been reading Elizabeth Smart by Grand Central Station. I sat down and wept. And the effect of these two books on me and their weaving of kind of mythological stories with contemporary language and situation, and just they were both such beautiful writers. They had a powerful effect on me. And I woke up one morning in 1990 something, 3, 4, and I beheld, and this is a proper magical moment of my life, of which there have been a few, I beheld a window that I could go through at that point in my life. If I started writing a novel that day, it would make me a writer at some point in the journey. And if I missed that window, I might have to wait another 20, 30, 40, 50 years, or never. The life would go another way. It was a total fork. And so, being a clever lad, I climbed through the window. It's a metaphorical window. And I started writing. And I started writing that day, and I wrote 5 pages a day, 6 days a week for about 7 weeks. This huge, great outpouring of this novel that I was trying to write, which is all about a boy who gives away half his soul to a peregrine falcon, which also gives a little bit of understory to falconer's joy. So that's kind of, there's something going on there between those two things. There's some complex dimensional interrelation. And this story that I started writing was way, way more than I could possibly understand or do anything with. It was a huge, huge story, and I knew how to start it, but I didn't know how to give it body, and I certainly didn't know how to end it. And so 20, however many years later, I'm still writing this book.
Right. You need to become the man who knows how to give this story. Because
Totally,
how old were you at the time when it first came?
I was 20, 21, something like
right.
that.
Yeah.
I knew in my bones some important stuff, but I didn't have language for it, certainly. And I didn't have the experience of how to integrate some of the complex stuff going on in that kind of story. Now I think I can do it service, and I'm trying to rewrite it at the moment. I'm trying to edit it basically to take out about 2/3. But being a father of 2 small children and with a partner who's not very well, there isn't a whole lot of time. But little bits here and there, and I am still in love with the story that I started writing that day, and the journey that that book has taken me on. I mean, I thought it was going to kill me. I really did. I just went, by the time I was finishing writing it the first few times, I just wanted to curl up and die on the pavement. It was so excruciatingly painful. But yeah, it is getting there, and it's going to be amazing.
I want to say epic. That's the word that's coming. It's been epic already, just hearing about the process. And I would imagine that something about having two small children and a wife who's not well, and you know, the years of living in the traveling theater, all of those things that need to integrate into that in some kind of way. So it comes when it comes, and we all wait with bated breath. I'm very excited
If you're
about
going to
this.
try and write about wholeness, you have to wait a long time. And I'm still not really qualified to write about it, but I can kind of point in the right general direction.
I'm super excited about it. So as soon as pre-sales start on that, I'll be buying by the tens. I'm excited.
Excellent.
So the last question on the podcast is always the same. And I feel like of all my guests, maybe your body of work tells me enough already about the answer, but you're a poet, so I'd still love to hear you say it. How do you personally cope with grief and rage?
I don't know whether I cope with grief and rage. Certainly in my involvement with Dark Mountain way back in 2012, 2013, there was a lot of opening up of grief about the world, and this moment, or the moments that have led up to this moment as well. There is still, having had children, there is an ocean of grief that can never be coped with. Mm-hmm. To know or suspect with a fair degree of certainty that what we're passing on to them is either irrevocably or substantially fucked in serious ways, and that they will harvest that bitter crop. And I rage about that. I rage quietly and simmeringly, and with a certain degree of impotent frustration and powerlessness. I attempted to channel that rage and grief into environmental activism, and bring about the disintegration and collapse of industrial civilization. But it's still there. Mm-hmm. It didn't work, not that time. And so I cope with the grief and rage by going out into the wilds. It's the big enough container to feel the grief and to feel the rage without getting kind of poisoned by them. I think for me, that's it. We're in new territory, I think, where grief isn't really, I think, even the word anymore, because you can grieve something that is passing or has passed into another state or another place, but to face the the annihilation of so many things of wonder and beauty requires some other thing, and we can't grieve our way out of it or through it. There's no I don't think there's any closure on that one, and so we just have to sit with it again and again and again, and get used to that being the way of it without it completely destroying our hearts. And the thing that that kind of is my counterbalance to that fairly hefty load of grief and despair and rage is the mysterious nature of hope. And the last time I did a wilderness vigil on the edge of Dartmoor, what I came back with from that was that it was supremely arrogant of me to discard hope completely, as if I knew the fate of things. Because there is so much, I mean, the vastest majority of things in this universe that I don't know. And to decide that I do know the fate of things is an arrogance and a disservice to the mystery as well. Mm. And I realized that the way I could understand hope was that in the same way that the human heart needs love, or something essential withers and dies, the human spirit needs hope. Otherwise, it too withers and dies. Mm. And so my understanding of what hope is has changed a lot down the years. It's no longer got anything to do with optimism. It is just a quality in and of itself that enables me to look at someone and not just burst into tears with the grief of it all, but to go, it is still worth loving and connecting, and for me, having and raising children and delighting in the world. So love and hope are very much interrelated. And just kind of one last thing just has come to me now, remembering when I was out on the moor this last 7 days, in the folds of the moor, it started to occur to me that what if hope is a deity? What if hope is a deity? And so I need perhaps to learn how to worship at the altar of hope in a particular way, not to achieve any end, but because hope is not something that is just a feeling or a state of mind. Perhaps it is this kind of active principle in the world, and developing a relationship with it, which has it more, it's a more personal relationship. Or I think you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So there was just this little interesting thought of maybe that would be a way to have a relationship with hope, which isn't either delusional or desperate, but is sacred and respectful, and is a courtship in itself.
I think I know what you mean. I also think I know who you're speaking to. I can, of the listeners right now, their faces, known and unknown, floating through. So thank you for speaking that into being. This has been a real pleasure. One of my favorite interviews ever. It's such an honor to have you here.
Oh,
thank
bless
you, Tom.
For me too. It's been lovely, Carmen.
What if hope is a deity? You know, it may be that for me personally, living that question may be the only way I really can have a deeper relationship with hope. Sacred, respectful courtship of a deity, that I can do. I'm not exaggerating when I say that that was one of my favorite of all the nearly 150 interviews I've done for this podcast. And I'm also not exaggerating or kidding when I say that I purchase editions of Sometimes a Wild God by the stack, because you never know when someone's going to need that kind of medicine. So if you're looking around and your family and friends seem to be like coming to the threshold of realizing that collapse is happening, this poem will push them over the edge and then catch them and pull them back up again. Sometimes a Wild God is like a mercy killing. It's an act of destruction and salvation all in one. You will thank me for that recommendation, and you will thank Tom for doing this to you. I also own art prints by his wife, Rima Staines. I have some of her work. Are you a Baba Yaga fan? Or does the sound of a piece of art called The Weed Wife fill you with excitement and desire as it does me, then I encourage you to check out this episode's show notes at numinouspodcast.com for a fulsome list of links to enter the world of hedge spoken press. And I'll also link to the works that Tom recommended by Gwyn Maxwell and two great Canadian, by the way, authors, Michael Ondaatje and Elizabeth Smart. Got to give the world some CanCon whenever we can. I had not known, actually, that Tom is a wilderness vigil guide. And actually, my own wilderness vigil occurred just a couple of years after I think he said his first was 2005. My first one was 2007. And now, if you've listened to the Numinous podcast for a while, you know I normally lead a 12-day wilderness rite of passage called the Numinous Quest each year. And in that 12 days, the questers are taught how to shelter in place in the BC backcountry with only a tarp and a sleeping bag and a first aid kit and water. They're also taught, ancestral skills that would allow them to know not only how to survive alone out there, but also to mature spiritually and return as an adult that their community can count on. And I was leading this work because I knew that someday soon we'd need more adults in the room when the shit really started to hit the fan with those large-scale converging emergencies I mentioned. So most of us are not initiated adults, and we haven't experienced the rites and rituals that would give us not only a felt sense of confidence, but a proven competence in a life or death situation. Now, obviously, I can't replicate that experience online in these pandemic times, but you know what? The information, like the mythological and theoretical underpinnings and those spiritual lessons, they remain important. And guess what? A pandemic is its own kind of rite of passage. It's still a good idea to have some enduring information and skills available to you as you navigate this particular type of emergency. So check out the Numinous Quest online under the Courses tab on my website, carmenspaniola.com. This fall, we're plunging into the task of initiating our inner adolescent, the one who is both the rebel and reluctant, the creative innovator and the saboteur who can get stuck in a quagmire of emotion at times. We've actually already begun the work of autumn, but I've delayed closing registration until October 1st. So latecomers will have the recording of the first workshop and join the program already in progress for the second workshop in early October, where we go deeply into the rituals of fall, which are severance, initiation, and soulcraft. And those are what prepare autumn's adolescent to survive winter and become a much-needed elder among us. Check it out at carmenspaniola.com. So today my listener shout-out and thank you goes to the 48 listeners in and around Cadair Idris and throughout Wales who've downloaded episodes in the last month. Deal! Thank you, I say. I appreciate you being here. Ancestry DNA tells me that I am your kin by 2%. Again, thank you. Thank you very much for downloading shows. Deal. You can follow me on Instagram at Carmen Spaniola and be the first to know about all my upcoming offerings by signing up for my newsletter at carmenspaniola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.